Good afternoon, Creating Change. My name is Stacey Simmons, and I am the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And this is the Mobilization for Reproductive Justice plenary session. So I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for this afternoon's conversation. To my right is Jessica González-Rojas, the Executive Director of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, the only national reproductive justice organization that specifically works to advance reproductive health and rights for Latinas. Jessica successfully forges connections between reproductive health, gender, immigration, LGBTQ liberation, labor, and Latina civil rights, breaking down barriers and building a strong Latina grassroots presence. She is a regular contributor to El Diario, La Prensa, and Huffington Post Latino Voices community. On pressing reproductive health issues in the community. What you probably don't know about Jessica is she broke her leg while skiing a couple of years ago.
Snowboarding.
Oh, snowboarding, excuse me. So anyway, careful while you're on the slopes, Jessica. And seated right next to Jessica is Kierra Johnson, the Executive Director of URGE. A lot of fans out there. URGE, Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, the leading pro-choice organization mobilizing and supporting the diverse upcoming generation of leaders. Kierra speaks clearly and powerfully about the need to engage young people and embolden young leaders across progressive movements. She's bolstered the conversation around youth and reproductive justice through her contribution to print, radio, television, and online media. What you probably don't know about Kierra is that she has a phenomenal singing voice. And don't be surprised if you find her performing in a smoky jazz club one night. But you won't catch her singing anything anytime soon because unfortunately, Kierra has temporarily lost her voice. And so, we are so pleased to present our first interactive plenary session where one of the panelists will be doing some of the responses via Twitter, an interactive Twitter.
What? So talk to me.
And then last but never least, we have Kris Hayashi, who is the new Executive Director Executive Director at the Transgender Law Center, an organization that's working to change law, policy, and attitude so that all people can live safely, authentically, and free from discrimination, regardless of their gender identity or expression. Kris has been active in social, racial, and economic justice organizing for over 20 years, serving as the Executive Director and Co-Director of the Audre Lorde Project in New York City, and a trainer-organizer at Western State Center in Portland, Oregon. And finally, as Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action in California, a group led by young people of color. What you may not know about Kris is he spends his spare time creating yummy fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi and whatever else, catches his eye that needs to be fermented. I don't think he means libations of the liquid type, just food, right? Anyway, without further ado, I'm really pleased to get things going with this conversation, which is one of the conversations that is really important to us at the task force because as you heard our Executive Director talk about yesterday, reproductive justice is an issue of LGBT equality and justice. It's all intertwined. It's all inextricably intertwined. We go back as far as the Roe v. Wade decision, and then the Lawrence decision, where actually LGBT people were actually able to achieve their privacy rights in the bedroom. It's hard to believe that there was a time when we actually did not have the ability to express ourselves sexually in the privacy of our homes or in any other way. And it's just a parallel track with respect to what is happening in this country around reproductive issues. It's a privacy issue. It's a right to choose how we form our families. It's about bodily autonomy. It's about access to health care, the full spectrum of health care. It's about demanding that we're treated with dignity and respect. And it's about making sure that those rights that we accrue are not just in law, but actually in practice. So when you show up in the doctor's office or your health provider's office, they may know what they're supposed to do by the book, but they actually are compelled to do it because they understand the consequences of not treating us the way they should. So I'm going to just jump right in. The purpose of our conversation today is to get us mobilized. What we really want to do today is make sure that you come away from this conversation with a few new ideas and a better understanding of what the issues are that are at stake. And actually, we want to make sure that we figure out how we can get more folks on board, because this sounds like a crowd that really gets it, and we're really, really delighted to be here and have these experts on board. So the first question that I have for the panel, and each of them are going to respond to this initial question, is what actually is the significance and value of reproductive justice, and why should LGBTQ people care about this at all?
So I'll start. I first want to acknowledge the activism and resistance that's happening outside around police violence and violence in our communities, and underscore how important it is to have this conversation inside as well, because the movement for reproductive justice has been founded by Black women, and and it continues to be led by people of color. So it's been 20 years since the founding of the term of reproductive justice, and we're honored to be here and to create the space to have this conversation here. It's taken 20 years, but we know the task force has been with us along the way, so I want to underscore that. And also underscore a lot of the elements that you said. Reproductive justice and LGBTQ liberation are both founded in critical values of bodily autonomy, in sexual freedom, in dignity, in justice, in human rights. And those values carry us forward. So the movements have always been closely aligned. And the leadership of the movements have largely been LGBTQ people of color. So that's really important to lift up and hold as we do this work. I think a couple of other important things is that we hold a commitment to ensuring that we have access to the care that we need, and that we can lead healthy reproductive lives, be able to create the families that we wish to create, if, when, and how to create them, and then being able to parent the children that we decide to have if we decide to have them. So we're also fighting for the access to the resources to make those decisions, because we often know that a right in the abstract without the resources to access that right is not a right at all. So we need to fight for those resources. And also our movements share a value that sexuality should be celebrated. Celebrated, right? Celebrated, not stigmatized. Whether or not the outcome is reproduction or not, that's an important value of the movement. So I believe that reproductive justice and LGBTQ liberation cannot be achieved without one another, and that these movements have to work together in tandem and at the intersections.
I'm gonna try to talk to you guys. I'm gonna give you some smoky this afternoon. I wanted to answer this question especially. We've all been in the work and in a movement or shown up to volunteer and felt like we had to check a part of our identity at the door. The justice framework is saying, bring your whole self into the room, right? You're not gonna check being Black at the door. You're not gonna check being poor at the door. You're not gonna check not having insurance at the door, or being queer, or being young, or being 65, or any of those things. And what the reproductive justice movement is saying is that we live at the intersections. And we also want to be doing organizing and advocacy at the intersections. We demand that our leadership We demand that organizations that we work with and for continue to do that work in the ways that we live, right? We're not interested in doing LGBT work without an acknowledgement of who we are as Black women. We're not interested in doing racial justice work, not acknowledging gender justice. We're not interested in doing political work without acknowledging how young people are systematically left out of the process. And that is what the justice work for us means. Reproductive justice is absolutely about contraception and motherhood and not being a parent. But it's also about how all of those things come together within all of the other identities we hold every day.
So I just want to start out by saying that it's an honor to be sitting here, and there's also many ways in which I feel like I shouldn't be, because I know that there are countless Black women, women of color, queer women who have been leading the reproductive justice movement for decades. And their voices are critical and important and need to be held up in these conversations. That said, I do have to say, as a trans person of color, the difference between the reproductive justice movement and the transgender nonconforming movement, to me, there's no difference. The intersections are clear and they're the same. For women of color, for people with disabilities, poor people, and LGBT people, both movements are about the violence our communities face, just in different forms. And I just think this cannot be said enough, but we're here in a city where Jessie, a young queer Latina, was murdered by the police. Since the beginning of this year, 5 trans women of color have been murdered, 1 just this week. Our communities, as trans and gender nonconforming people, are facing incredible violence. And the murders that we hear about are only the ones we hear about, right? We know that part of it is that our community is more visible, we're more in the media, but we know that we lose so many members of our communities daily, and they don't make the news. For trans and gender nonconforming people, as is true for women of color, and people with disabilities, reproductive injustice at its core is about state and state-sanctioned violence, structural violence against our bodies, our lives, and our families. The murders of trans women of color, the police violence faced by Black and brown communities and communities of color, and state control over women and trans and gender nonconforming people's bodies are all rooted in a larger system in which we're not meant to survive. So, about a week ago, I was actually in New York City, and I was listening to a panel that was being moderated by Raina Gossett, amazing Black trans woman doing organizing out in New York City, previously with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. And Kierra Page, I don't know if Kierra's in the room. If she is, she should wave or something so folks can see her.
There she is.
Yes.
Some girl.
So Kierra Page is the executive director of the Audre Lorde Project out of New York City. And she stated very clearly what reproductive justice means for trans and gender nonconforming and queer people of color. She said, population control is and has been used to justify practices of sterilization, hospitalization, incarceration, and institutionalization of women of color, queer, trans, poor people of color, immigrants, and people with disabilities, because we are seen as expendable if we are not reproducing labor for profit. As leaders of the LGBT movement and reproductive justice movement, we need to talk about the many ways in which our communities are facing structural violence, in which our lives are being taken away from us due to lack of access to healthcare, jobs, housing, incarceration, and detention. And there are models, there are organizations that have been doing this work for decades. Groups like Fierce out of New York City, led by LGBT youth of color. Song, Southerners on New Ground of the South. And new organizations like the Trans Women of Color Collective that's been doing work nationally to bring visibility to our communities. The last thing I'll say before we move on to the next question is that, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. Also central to both movements is a belief in body self-determination. That as a trans person, I should have power over my body and what happens to it. That everyone should have access to health care that affirms our identities, our bodies, and our families. And I'm going to give one specific example, particularly for trans and gender nonconforming folks. So the majority of states in the US have a surgery requirement in order for trans and gender nonconforming people to change our gender on state documents. This means that, for example, for a trans woman to change her gender marker from male to female, the state is requiring her sterilization. That's right. And I'm going to quote Cecilia Chung, who is the senior strategist at the Transgender Law Center. She says, in most states, gender change is tied to hysterectomy or vaginoplasty. It is time to recognize that as a form of coerced sterilization, which totally negates the rights of trans folk to raise our own children. This is not a thing of the past. I personally have had doctors tell me, why don't you just get rid of everything, for no medically necessary reason, with no comprehension of me as a person that may want a family and children.
Thank you. That was a great first question, everyone. So one of the things that we talked about when we were getting ready for this afternoon's talk is the fact that it's very complex and it's very multi-layered and it's nuanced. And it's difficult to do this work. As someone who goes on the Hill to lobby, I know that you can tell when a staffer's eyes are glazing over when you're just throwing too many terms at them or just throwing too many concepts at them. And we also struggle, because we work within multiple movements, to figure out how to applaud the successes while also mourning the losses. So we recall what happened when the Supreme Court gave us a positive outcome with the Windsor decision in marriage equality, or partially, striking down DOMA, but at the same time gutting the Voting Rights Act. We recall what happened when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, but at the same time the DREAM Act couldn't even get a vote on the floor in the Senate. So what we do at the task force is figure out how to put out our press releases in ways that are nuanced and really reflect the fact that we belong to multiple communities and multiple movements. And now that I have like 3 leaders from organizations who are making decisions on a daily basis, I just want to pick your brains and have you talk to us a little bit about how you go through that process of figuring out how to really execute the intersectionality that is our work. So check out, Kierra's going to be tweeting a response.
Keep going.
So I think what's important, can folks hear me? Okay. I think what's important to remember is that we live complex lives and we understand in our own bodies how complex and intersectional our lives are. For me, as a queer Latina who is white presenting, who is in a heteronormative relationship, my mother's Puerto Rican, my dad's an immigrant, there's a lot of complexity around that in my identity. I understand how nuanced lives are. And I think what's important in terms of our leadership and our values is that understanding that, people's lives are complex, and it's important never to make assumptions about anyone's circumstances. And when we do this work, we have to bring the whole person, as Kierra said. This is about bringing your whole selves to this work and acknowledging how the struggle for liberation can't be achieved when we leave communities behind. So Latina Institute, we try to live our values. Our values are salud, dignidad, justicia, which is health, dignity, and justice. So that's a value that we hold dearly, and we seek to advance policies and practices and center the voices of those most impacted in the work when we're doing the organizing and activism. And that's why I commend all the incredible activism that's happening, because it's so critical to hear from those most impacted, because they are the agents of change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for TLC and in other spaces and movements in which I've done this work, it's really about thinking about who are the folks among us who are most vulnerable, who are facing the greatest barriers to survival. And I think when we are talking about the right to have control over what happens to our bodies and our desires around families and reproduction, prisons and detention facilities are the furthest from those rights. So if we say those are the furthest from the rights and this is the issue we're going to focus on, right? So trans women are often denied timely access to hormones in immigration detention, experience high levels of sexual violence within immigration detention, and often experience extreme harms within detention, such as being denied access to bras or forced to shower with men. The Transgender Law Center, we're representing a trans woman. Her name's Michelle Norsworthy. She's being held in a California men's prison. Michelle was denied gender-affirming surgery, even though her psychologist had repeatedly concluded that it was medically necessary to treat her. She was also denied a legal name change because the name she would like to use is a traditionally feminine name. So this is just one example, right? We know there are countless trans women of color who are currently incarcerated. We're also working on a case of Nicole, a Guatemalan transgender woman currently being detained by ICE in an all-male facility. Nicole suffered nearly a decade of sexual and physical violence in her home country, then to come to the US, where she continued to face sexual harassment and abuse at the hands of ICE, staff, and other detained immigrants for being a trans woman. Fusion recently reported that Nicole's experience is not unique, right? In fact, although transgender women make up only 1 out of every 500 detainees, they make up a shocking 1 out of every 5 substantiated cases of sexual assault in immigration detention facilities. So it's clear that if we look at incarceration in prisons as a place in which our communities have the least control over our bodies and our families and our lives, that if we focus on this issue, it's going to bring together the intersections of our communities. And I also want to say that while transgender nonconforming people clearly are facing incredible oppression, harassment, and violence, that our communities are also incredibly resilient and powerful, that we are leaders, and that we are organizing to change these conditions. Folks should know who Miss Major is. She's an elder in the community. She was actually supposed to be here at this conference. She has for decades organized for the rights of trans women of color who are incarcerated. The organization that she founded, the Transgender Intersex Justice Project out of California, is one of few organizations led by trans women of color who are formerly incarcerated, who are supporting members of our community who are currently locked up and fighting for their rights. There are organizations who are working on these issues, who are moving it forward, and we need to support them.
Thank you. I think that what I took away from what you just said, Kris, is those kinds of stories, those powerful stories, are the kinds of things that change people's minds, change their hearts, and open up possibilities for us in terms of the advocacy work that we're doing. I don't think there's any way that someone listening to what you've just described could, not really find some place in their hearts to actually have compassion and figure out how to move things along in a way that's going to get different outcomes than what you described. So thank you both for responding to that.
And I just want to acknowledge the resilience, right? I think we are inspired every day about the resilience despite the systemic barriers we face, despite the obstacles we face, the challenges, the laws that are set up against us. We are a resilient community, and that resiliency inspires us and sustains us.
So that is so important because, often we look at this work through a deficit model, and we have to remember the tremendous assets that our community has to do this work.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So now I'm going to move us to a topic that is actually at the heart of lots of public debate. People seem to go right to the heart of the issue of abortion when they frequently think about reproductive justice. And a few years ago, back in 2007, the task force had put out a pro-choice statement. And there was an article that appeared in the Washington Blade that heavily criticized the task force for doing that and basically said that, gays don't have any business dealing with choice issues or abortion, and there's no such thing as oops babies in the gay community, right? So, and by the way, you can't find that article online. I tried to find references to it, but I can't find it. But anyway, so this was like 2007. Now here we are in 2015. Obviously, abortion is an important issue. Can you tell folks who are wondering what they say to those people who think, well, we don't really need abortion, so why should we care about it? Just like we don't need birth control, why should we care about it? I sort of interrogate the assumptions there and talk about that a bit more.
This is easy. We're going to do some call and response right now. Do queer people have abortions? Yeah. The end.
I'm so glad you have your voice.
I mean, really, right? There's nothing else to say, right?
Well said.
If we stop trying to define what this work is in everyone's lives, if we do the really hard work of just listening and then applying what's coming from people, then it's not hard. It's not complicated. It's not complex. It's just real. Guess what? Lesbians also use condoms. Right. So can you put them in our bags? Thanks. Thanks.
That was a good read. Thank you.
I'm just saying, I'm not offended if you put a condom in my bag. It will get used. Right? So that's what it's about, It's like I think we often define or want to define what the queer experience is.
That's right, and not the least of which, of course, there are bisexual people who are having sex with people, right? So,
I mean, there are bisexual people, and there are people who play.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I'd like to talk about my own experience in that I never came out of I wasn't in the closet. I was straight, and then I was not. Really not. I was wait, and so there's also just living. There's just living, and there's playing, and there's bisexuality, and there are accidents, and there's sexual assault.
That's right.
All of those things are real, and so we have to acknowledge, right, that the spectrum of experiences of queer people are real. They're vast, right? Mm-hmm.
So we've been talking a lot today about reproductive justice and about the need for LGBTQ movements and repro movements to work more closely together. The marriage equality agenda is obviously cresting and having sort of significant progress. And we know that there are a number of issues still left on the equality agenda and on the repro justice agenda. Can you talk a bit about what are the emerging issues and what you see on the horizon? I feel like anyone who heard Ray's talk yesterday probably already heard that, so you could just refer back to Ray's talk yesterday if you want, just to save time, but.
Well, I think what I want to say, though, is that I don't think it's about emerging issues. These issues have always been there, right? Because we live it, right? And oftentimes they have just not gotten the resources or the attention that they deserve. So I think that's important to say. And with that, I do have a list. So I think it is important, and I think it's already come up in a lot of our remarks, but I think ending detention and deportation that tears families apart, including LGBTQ families, is critical. Ensuring quality, affordable, accessible health care, including gender-affirming health care and sexual and reproductive health care, must be respected as a human right. And that's despite immigration status, gender identity, sexual orientation, how much money is in your pocket. I think we need to stop and end the use as religion as a form of discrimination and harm. And remember that religion is something that's used for love and respect, right? I think we need a strong economic justice agenda. So many amazing advocates are advancing that issue and talking about queer survival economies and what that means, and the economic agenda that incorporates the diverse experiences and circumstances and conditions that queer people face. And lastly, we need to fight for the resources for our communities to organize, to mobilize, and lead the efforts and the movements for social justice and human rights.
So Kierra's tweeting. Look to Kierra's tweets for responses to that. So Jessica, one of the things you mentioned was the religious freedom issue. And many people are hearing about the religious freedom assaults that are happening in our communities. And one of the things that I'd love to hear you all talk about is what you believe the role is of faith and advocacy in this work that we're doing.
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. And so, the first thing that I want to say is that as LGBT people, as trans and gender nonconforming people, particularly folks of color, we know, right, that our communities have drawn a lot of strength and power from religion and spirituality, and that there are also ways in which we have really hard, complicated relationships with religion and spirituality. So I just wanted to start by saying that. And, at TLC, we believe that all people, not just trans people, understand that the concept of religious freedom doesn't mean that a religious belief should be able to be used against us, to harm us and to discriminate against us. And what we're seeing now are attempts to use this protection to take it from the employee and give it to the employer, or from the person who's going into the store and giving it to the business owner, so that those businesses can now say they can refuse service to us or not hire us because of their religious beliefs. And, it's clear, right, that is using religion in a way that's just seeking to hurt us, and not about sharing and honoring religious beliefs.
I'm from Georgia, originally. Is Georgia in the house? Damn, we gotta get more Georgia. Colorado in the house? Lived too. We have a long history and legacy of progressive religious action in this country. And we have a lot of power there that we don't have to cede away to conservatives. As someone who comes from the South and someone who works a lot with people in the Midwest, it's really fucking annoying when people act like we're backwards or don't understand or somehow oppressed by our religions, when we are actually progressive and advocating and activists because of our religion. And so I think it's important for us to find and where that power really is, right? I heard it the other day, we need to engage with clergy. We need to engage with religious people and not make assumptions that they're not with us. Because if we just listen and put the assumptions on a shelf, we'll find that so many spiritual and religious people are willing to walk with us, behind us, in front of us, if we're willing to engage them in a real conversation.
No, I thank you. Thank you for saying that too, because I know that I've been in many spaces where it's been clear, at least with respect to talking to African American clergy, is their ask is, please, when you're talking about these issues, don't assume that I'm an enemy just because you happen to see a Black Baptist preacher. I'm someone who, can listen, can reason, and definitely is moved by actual stories of what's happening to people. And I'm trying to figure it all out, how to minister to members of my congregation who are coming out, or members of my congregation who are trying to sort out their lives and what's going on. And I want to be the best equipped person to be able to do that. So thank you for making that.
And a lot of, we primarily work with 18 to 25-year-olds. And while more and more young people don't identify, like as religious, there's a lot of folks who still identify as spiritual. And one of the biggest barriers is that people don't want to do this work separate from the communities that they're in. Whether that be religious or, geographically, or the families that they grew up in. And so, they want to do this work and not feel isolated. We want to do this work and not feel isolated. And so how do we create a context where you can be Catholic and support abortion?
Right.
Where you can be Black in Alabama and be like, hell yeah, contraception rules, right? Like, it's important that we're able to do this, not as Black folks who have to move to San Francisco. How about we invest in people where they're at, like in Wichita, Kansas? Right? Like, and support being, wherever they're at, culturally, while doing this advocacy.
That's right.
And I think as a Latina Catholic, if I could offer, I think there's a distinction often between the pews and the pulpit, right? And for Latinas, for many Catholics, the Vatican prohibits the use of hormonal contraception, but yet 90% of married Catholic Latinas have used hormonal contraception. So I think it's important to remember that the leadership of some churches, not all, and that's important to remember, of some churches don't represent the community. And the community and the church are the people. And I think that the distinction around the religious refusals and also the Supreme Court decisions is that we're seeing the rights and privileges of personhood being conferred to corporations, while seeing the rights and privileges of personhood taken away from actual human beings, right? We're seeing the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act.
That's right.
We're seeing abortion legislated nearly out of existence, and we're seeing this epidemic of police violence where the humanity of trans people and people of color are lost. So I think it's important to recognize the cultural piece and our experiences with faith, and then how that's being legislated and in the courthouses and in the state capitals.
Great. So we're winding down, getting to the end of our time up here, so I really want to get to the core of the matter in terms of what we said we were going to talk about, which is the mobilization piece. And I would love for each of you to talk about how we do this mobilization, how we bring more people to the table. What does it really call for? What do we need? Kierra mentioned investing resources in Wichita, Kansas. I heard that, I'm sure. There's a funder out there who heard that too.
Sure, I can start. And so, I'm actually going to ask people to hold silence and not applaud as I'm kind of closing out. So, I want to ask everyone who took the stage yesterday or the day before to stand or to raise your hand. So if you can stay standing if you like, or sit, but every day of creating change, Black, Brown, First Nations, people of color, trans, and GNC folks, youth, queer folks took over this stage. And I want to be really clear about what happened. While we should be proud of the strength, strategy, and mobilizing skills that led to those actions, we should not be proud that those actions happened. Those actions happened because as trans and gender nonconforming people, as people of color, as queer people, we said we can no longer wait. We are grieving and we are angry, and our communities are dying. And Black and brown, trans and gender nonconforming communities, and queer people of color, led by Black and brown trans women of color, said to us as the LGBT movement, particularly to us national organizations, and I put the Transgender Law Center in that pool as well, no more business as usual, right? The other night, Bambi Salcedo said, if you serve us, include us. Every LGBT leader, every organization working for social change, for reproductive justice, when she said that, she was talking to us. TGNC communities, trans and gender nonconforming people of color, have always existed. We are resilient, we are beautiful, we are leaders, and we have been throughout history. As an LGBT movement, we were sent a clear message over the course of this conference that what we are doing, not what we are saying or what we're tweeting, though the tweeting's good, to address the needs and issues facing trans and gender nonconforming communities and LGBT people of color communities. How as funders and donors, we're resourcing and supporting organizations led by trans and gender nonconforming people and queer people of color. And most importantly, what we are doing to center the leadership of trans and gender nonconforming people of color, particularly Black, trans women, and trans women of color, is not enough. And that our actions, not our words, are what is important.
I think to mobilize people, we have to stop waiting for them to come to us and go to them, right? As a movement, a reproductive rights, health justice movement, it's important to be able to recognize, right, that people want to do this work in different ways. You know, a lot of young people don't want to go to URGE or NARAL or Planned Parenthood to do this work. They want to do reproductive rights work. They want to do gender justice work in an immigrant rights organization. They want to do it at a human or civil rights organization. I think there are a lot of young people who want to do, or similar, right? Like they care about LGBT rights and justice and liberation. And they're not going to go to the task force, right, or to HRC or Victory Fund or even any of our state LGBT organizations. They want to do that work at the NAACP, you know? They want to do that work in different ways, in different places. And so I think it's important to figure out if we're going to let our communities define their own leadership, how do we support that leadership even when it doesn't come in the box we think it should come in? When they don't want to come to the boxes that we've prescribed for them. I'm working for young people. I do work for them. I am their slave. Slave to the young people. I have to say that we often trivialize the contributions that young people make. We want their young faces, we want their energetic feet, but we don't think about the strategic power that comes when we engage them authentically and fully in creating messaging, in creating organizing strategies, in creating campaigns. And so I think that's in how we think about mobilizing, we've got to think about who our audiences are, and it means shifting. It means shifting. We started off a very white organization 20 years ago. We're not that anymore. Over 50% of our constituents are people of color. That wasn't organic. That means we've got to do the hard work. It means we've got to uproot what we're used to doing. It means we've got to be uncomfortable. It means we've got to be willing to be responsive to the needs of an emerging, evolving, and changing constituency if we are really committed to being about justice.
I believe people are the experts of their own struggle. And I just want to underscore what was said, that we need to meet folks where they're at and ensure that the voices of the most impacted are the agents of change. And I am inspired by those who work at the intersections and who are doing cross-movement work. And I'm looking at Felipe in front of me, and I'm going to embarrass you, because I am moved by the queer undocumented movement that has centered the lives of queer people, of the undocumented movement, who has centered the lives of queer people, and that get that reproductive justice is an immigration issue. When our children are called anchor babies in this country, that's a reproductive justice issue. When our families are being torn apart, that's a reproductive justice issue.
Right.
So we need to work within those spaces that Kierra talked about, whichever way, and ensure that the intersections are brought to life in ways that meet our community where they're at and highlight the human rights and the dignity of our community that we deserve.
Terrific, thank you. So, I hope that folks heard some really good food for thought for future conversations, future conferences. There is a workshop immediately after the plenary. Many folks from these organizations are going to be in that workshop. It's going to be in Director's Row, Room I at 3 o'clock, Beyond Choice, Reproductive Justice Organizing and Advocacy. So
And there's a karaoke tonight.
Oh,
and I'm sorry, I have the information somewhere. Talk to anyone in the first row here. Karaoke tonight, because we got to celebrate. We got to also have fun. Tweet it out. CC
It's being tweeted right now.
So please join me in thanking our brilliant panelists for today's conversation.
Let's hear it for our panelists.